gradients in Photoshop. So a gradient is a blend of colors used to fill a selection of a layer or an entire layer itself. So there are two pieces that are primary tools for this. Number one being my gradient tool, and the gradient tool is along with the paint bucket tool, 3D material drop. So it's at the top of the stack, so you should be able to find your gradient tool. When I click the gradient tool, up at the top, my options bar here changes to my gradient options. I see some presets. If I click, you can go ahead and click on the little gear icon to open up additional gradients. So then you can see I can quickly select one of these if I so desire. I have different types of gradients as well. Those being a linear gradient, which is the first in the list. And the linear gradient basically allows me to drag in a linear fashion, and I can drag however I want in whatever angle. If I drag small, my gradient fills a small area. If I drag large, it fills a much larger. And I actually can drag outside of my document. If you can see, I'm over in my layers. Now I'm up in my color. And so that gradient starts here and it ends somewhere actually over here on the right side of my interface. And I am seeing only what's visible in my window or my document. The radial gradient is the next one, and this one radiates out from the center. So again, I can draw small and make very tiny, or I can drag large. And if I drag large, you can kind of see how it does an circular, kind of concentric circles here with my color blend. The next one is the angle, and this one's a little unique in the fact that I click and drag and I sort of create an angle that then swoops around. So if I click and drag, it swoops around. And so my starting color is here, my ending color is here, and my gradiated blends of color go around. The next is a reflective. The reflected is a nice way to create what would appear to be like pipes or wires. If I drag small, I get smaller areas, larger. So you can kind of get an interesting effect with those. The next here is the starburst, and that allows me to again draw kind of like a radial, but it's going to burst out in a more angled, pointed fashion. The properties for the gradient, I'm going to pull out the properties panel, which will give me all the options for my gradient. So we specifically want to look here. We have the presets, anything that we see we'd like to start with. Sliding this over a bit so you can see, we have a diamond on the gradient, and you'll see that diamond both on the canvas and in two sliders in the properties panel. That diamond indicates the midpoint, and so as you see, I'm sliding it on the slider in the properties panel, and it will change the midpoint of where there's a 50-50 blend of that color. Gradients are made up of what's called color stops. We'll see that circle both in the panel and on the canvas. When I double click on that circle, you can see my color picker appears, and this allows me to change my color. So I can double click on the canvas on the circle color stop as well. Component here in the properties gradient panel is the opacity controls. You see we have stops there as well. By default they're black, meaning the opacity is 100. When I click, as I just did, look at the opacity, it's at 0%, so it appears as white. So that's going to affect the color. So we have the color slider above this. This is the opacity. Now when I click and add colors, since my opacity is at 0, that means I'm not seeing any color. And I can try, this is going to be something that's going to be a bit frustrating. You're trying to apply a color, it's not working. I need to go down to my opacity and either convert it back to 100% or drag to remove it. When I do that, I didn't know what color was there, so I do have to reassign a color. So know the color stops. Also, I can click and drag to remove them off the ramp. And I can adjust my mid-tone. Remember the mid-tone where the colors are blending 50-50 is the diamond. You can see there's a location box right below that color slider in the panel that is adjusting as I'm sliding. So customizable gradients takes a little bit of exploration, but there's a lot of option there. And there's that location. So the last thing I wanted to point out is what happens in your layers panel when you create a gradient. You end up with a gradient fill layer. By double clicking on that thumbnail, you can see some of the options for that gradient fill, a little bit of customizing and editing ability with that. So gradients in Photoshop.